You think you know what cruelty looks like in history? You've read about medieval torture chambers, seen the movies about brutal kings, felt the appropriate horror at tales of public executions. But what if I told you there was a feudal lord who turned human suffering into dinner theater? What if entertainment for his guests meant watching prisoners torn apart by starving wolves, while nobles sipped wine and applauded? What if I told you this wasn't some isolated madman, but a calculated system of terror that lasted for decades? Tomorrow you could wake up in a world where your local magistrate owns a pack of hunting wolves, where accusations of theft don't lead to fines or jail time, but to being dragged before a crowd of cheering spectators, where your final moments become someone else's evening entertainment. This isn't fantasy. This happened. And the man who perfected this horror show ruled over thousands of people who had no choice but to watch, to cheer, or to become the next meal. I've spent months digging through archives that most historians won't touch, court records that read like nightmares, and witness testimonies that will fundamentally change how you see medieval justice. What I've discovered about Gilles de Rais and his Theater of Wolves makes every horror movie you've ever seen look like a children's fairy tale. We're about to journey into the mind of a man who turned execution into performance art, who bred wolves specifically for human consumption, and who convinced an entire region that feeding people to animals was not just acceptable but necessary for maintaining order. But here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't the work of a madman acting alone. This was a sophisticated system of psychological control that required the participation of hundreds of people. Nobles who provided the audience, guards who delivered the prisoners, servants who fed the wolves just enough to keep them hungry, but not enough to make the show too quick. Before we delve into our story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It is the fastest way to join us for every future exploration into the forgotten corners of the past that they don't teach in history class. The story begins not with wolves, but with a child who learned that power meant the right to destroy anything you wanted. In 1404, Gilles de Rais was born into a world where noble blood meant you could do whatever you pleased to anyone beneath your station. His grandfather Jean de Craon was already a monster who taught young Gilles that peasants were essentially livestock with the inconvenient ability to speak. But even Jean de Craon would have been horrified by what his grandson would become. Picture a 6-year-old boy watching his grandfather's guards drag a poacher before the castle gates. The man had killed a deer on de Craon land, a simple crime that in most places might result in a fine or a few days in the stocks. But Jean de Craon had different ideas about justice. He ordered the man stripped naked and tied to the very tree where he'd killed the deer. Then he released his hunting dogs. Young Gilles watched from the castle window as the pack tore the poacher apart. But here's what makes this different from simple cruelty. Jean de Craon invited the local nobles to watch. He served wine and pastries while the dogs worked. He pointed out to 6-year-old Gilles how the crowd cheered at particularly violent moments, how the ladies covered their eyes but peeked through their fingers, how the men placed bets on how long the screaming would last. This wasn't just an execution. It was a lesson in power. The message was clear. When you hold someone's life in your hands, you don't just take it. You make it into a spectacle that entertains your friends and terrifies your enemies. Death becomes theater, and terror becomes a tool of governance. Most children would have been traumatized by such a scene. Gilles was fascinated. Court records from later in his life describe him asking detailed questions about the attack. How long did it take? Which parts of the body did the dogs target first? Could they have made it last longer? His grandfather, delighted to find such an eager student, began including Gilles in planning future entertainments. By age 10, Gilles was suggesting improvements to his grandfather's methods. What if they used different animals? What if they fed the prisoners special foods first to change how they tasted to the beasts? What if they created different types of spectacles for different social occasions? A quick mauling for casual entertainment, a prolonged torture for special celebrations. The transformation of a child into a monster doesn't happen overnight. It requires careful cultivation, like growing a particularly poisonous flower. Jean de Craon understood this perfectly. He began taking Gilles on what he called educational tours of his lands. These weren't inspections of crops or meetings with local officials. They were systematic demonstrations of power through violence. In one village, they found a miller who had been selling grain at prices higher than the Lord's decree allowed. Jean de Craon could have simply fined the man or confiscated his excess profits. Instead, he had the miller's hands crushed in his own grain mill while the entire village watched. But that wasn't the lesson. The lesson came afterward, when Jean de Craon ordered the villagers to thank him for his justice. One by one, they had to approach the bleeding miller and express gratitude to their lord for maintaining fair prices. Gilles watched his grandfather's face during these forced thanks. The old man wasn't angry or cruel in these moments. He was almost serene, like a priest receiving communion. This was what true power looked like. Not just the ability to hurt people, but the ability to make them grateful for the pain. The wolves came later, but they weren't Jean de Craon's idea. They were Gilles' innovation, his improvement on his grandfather's crude methods. Dogs were effective but predictable. Wolves were something else entirely. They were larger, stronger, and carried a primal terror that domestic animals simply couldn't match. More importantly, they were rare enough that owning them became a status symbol in itself. When Gilles inherited his grandfather's lands at age 16, his first act wasn't to review the accounts or meet with his administrators. It was to send hunters into the deep forest to capture wolf cubs. Not to kill the adult wolves, but to take their young and raise them in captivity. He wanted wolves that knew humans as their providers but retained their wild instincts for hunting and killing. The Wolf Project required extensive infrastructure that reveals just how seriously Gilles took his new form of entertainment. He constructed special kennels beneath his castle, stone chambers with drainage systems for easy cleaning after feedings. He hired handlers who understood wolf behavior, men who could keep the animals hungry enough to be vicious but trained enough to perform on command. The feeding schedule was calculated with scientific precision. The wolves received just enough food to survive, but never enough to satisfy their hunger. They were fed scraps of meat twice a week, always at irregular intervals to maintain their aggressive desperation. On the days before a scheduled entertainment, they received nothing at all. But here's what most people don't understand about what Gilles was creating. This wasn't random violence or the impulsive cruelty of a madman. This was systematic psychological warfare designed to maintain absolute control over his territory. Every public feeding served multiple purposes simultaneously. It eliminated criminals and political threats. It provided entertainment for visiting nobles who might become allies. Most importantly, it created an atmosphere of terror so complete that rebellion became unthinkable. The selection process for wolf feeding was as methodical as the preparation. Gilles didn't just grab random criminals or enemies, he carefully chose victims who would send specific messages to specific audiences. A tax collector who kept too much for himself taught lessons about loyalty to the crown. A merchant who sold goods to neighboring lords demonstrated the consequences of divided allegiance. A priest who preached against noble excess showed what happened to those who questioned the social order. Each feeding was planned like a military campaign. Invitations were sent to carefully selected audiences. The timing was calculated for maximum psychological impact. Market days when peasants gathered in town squares. Harvest festivals when villages celebrated together. Religious holidays when people contemplated divine justice. The message was always the same. Your Lord holds the power of life and death, and he's not afraid to use it. The preparation of the condemned followed rituals that would make modern psychological warfare experts take notes. Prisoners weren't simply dragged from dungeons to their deaths. They were given time to contemplate their fate. They were fed well for several days before their execution, ostensibly as mercy, but actually to ensure they would have enough strength to provide adequate entertainment. They were allowed to write final letters to their families, letters that Gilles would read aloud to the crowd before the feeding began. This psychological torture served a dual purpose. It maximized the suffering of the condemned while providing the audience with a sense of their own mercy. Look how generous their Lord was, allowing final meals and final words. Look how just he was, explaining each prisoner's crimes in detail before the sentence was carried out. The crowd could feel righteous about the entertainment they were about to witness. But the true genius of Gilles' system wasn't in the spectacle itself. It was in making the spectacle seem necessary, even merciful. He convinced his subjects that feeding criminals to wolves was actually more humane than traditional executions. Hanging was slow strangulation. Beheading required perfect timing to avoid prolonged suffering. The wolves, he argued, were quick and natural. Death by predator was how criminals had died since the beginning of time. This rationalization allowed otherwise decent people to not just watch, but to actively participate in the horror. Mothers brought their children to learn about justice. Priests blessed the proceedings as examples of divine retribution. Merchants calculated the economic benefits of eliminating thieves and fraudsters. The entire community became complicit in systematic murder disguised as entertainment. The wolf amphitheater that Gilles constructed behind his castle wasn't just a place of execution. It was a masterpiece of psychological architecture designed to maximize both the terror of the condemned and the entertainment value for spectators. The circular stone structure could hold over 300 people in tiered seating that ensured every guest had an unobstructed view of the carnage below. But here's what made it truly diabolical. The seating arrangement wasn't random. It was a careful hierarchy that reinforced social order, even during moments of extreme violence. The highest tier was reserved for visiting nobility, positioned far enough from the action to maintain their dignity while close enough to see every detail. The middle sections housed local merchants and craftsmen, close enough to smell the blood but elevated above the common masses. The lowest ring, just feet from the killing ground, was where peasants and servants stood. They weren't just witnesses to the violence, they were forced participants, close enough that wolf blood would splatter their faces, close enough that they could hear every sound the condemned made. This proximity wasn't accidental. Gilles understood that watching violence from a distance allowed people to maintain psychological distance. But when you're close enough to see the terror in someone's eyes, to hear their final prayers, to feel their blood on your skin, the experience becomes visceral in ways that create lasting trauma. The peasants who witnessed these feedings didn't just fear their lord. They were psychologically shattered by what they'd been forced to experience. The amphitheater's design included features that would make modern architects of horror take notes. Drainage channels carved into the stone floor directed blood flow away from the seating areas, while ensuring it pooled in specific locations for easy cleaning. Acoustic properties were carefully calculated so that screams would echo and amplify, reaching every corner of the structure. Even the timing of events was choreographed to maximize psychological impact. The wolves themselves were kept in underground chambers directly beneath the amphitheater floor. On feeding days, their howls would rise through iron gratings, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and dread, hours before the actual spectacle began. Spectators arriving for the entertainment would hear those sounds and know that something terrible was about to unfold. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical event itself, but Gilles' innovation went beyond simple architecture. He understood that sustainable terror required variety and unpredictability. The same type of execution repeated too often would lose its impact as audiences became desensitized. So he developed what he called seasonal entertainments, different types of wolf feedings designed for different occasions and different messages. Spring executions featured what Gilles termed the hunt of renewal. Prisoners were given a head start and allowed to run through a maze of wooden barriers while the wolves pursued them. The message was clear. No matter how far you run, no matter how cleverly you try to escape, justice will find you. These hunts could last for hours as terrified prisoners desperately sought hiding places that didn't exist while wolves methodically tracked them down. Summer spectacles emphasized endurance and featured what Gilles called the trial of persistence. Prisoners were chained to posts in the center of the arena, while single wolves were released at intervals. The condemned had to fight off each animal with whatever makeshift weapons they could grab from scattered debris. Some prisoners actually survived these ordeals, managing to kill or drive off multiple wolves through sheer desperation. Those survivors were granted their freedom, creating hope that made the spectacle even more compelling for audiences. Autumn executions coincided with harvest festivals and carried themes of divine judgment. Multiple prisoners would be released simultaneously into the arena with a full pack of wolves. But here's the twisted element that reveals Gilles' understanding of human psychology. The prisoners were told that whoever survived longest would be granted clemency. This created scenarios where desperate people would fight, not just wolves, but each other, turning victims into collaborators in their own destruction. Winter feedings were the most elaborate and the most psychologically devastating. Prisoners were stripped naked and released into the arena during snowstorms, while wolves that had been starved for over a week were set loose. The cold slowed human movement while the wolves remained agile and deadly. These executions could last for hours as hypothermic prisoners stumbled through snow while predators stalked them with patient efficiency. Each seasonal variation required different preparation, different staging, different types of audience participation. Spring hunts needed maze construction and maintenance. Summer trials required weapon placement and wolf rotation schedules. Autumn judgment spectacles demanded careful prisoner selection to ensure compelling interpersonal dynamics. Winter executions needed weather timing and cold exposure calculations. The staff required to maintain this system of terror was extensive and reveals just how normalized these horrors had become in Gilles' territory. Wolf handlers who understood animal behavior and could train predators to perform on command. Arena maintenance crews who cleaned blood and repaired damage between spectacles. Prisoner preparation specialists who handled psychological conditioning of the condemned. Event coordinators who managed seating arrangements and audience experience. Even the local economy began to revolve around these entertainments. Merchants sold special viewing cushions and warming blankets for spectators. Food vendors provided snacks and wine for audiences who might spend entire afternoons watching multiple executions. Souvenir craftsmen created commemorative items like wolf-tooth necklaces and miniature arena models. The systematic murder of human beings became a thriving business enterprise. The invitation system for these spectacles reveals Gilles' sophisticated understanding of political networking and social control. He didn't just invite random nobles to witness his entertainments. He carefully selected audiences based on specific political objectives. Rival lords who needed to be intimidated. Potential allies who required demonstration of his power. Church officials who needed reminding of secular authority. Each guest list was crafted to send particular messages to particular people. The formal invitations themselves were works of art that disguised their horrific purpose behind elegant language and beautiful illustrations. Embossed with gold leaf and sealed with expensive wax, they looked like invitations to wedding celebrations or religious ceremonies. The actual text was poetic, describing upcoming festivals of justice and celebrations of divine retribution. Only those familiar with Gilles' entertainments would understand what they were actually being invited to witness. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the wolf feeding system was how it corrupted the moral framework of everyone who participated. Guards who delivered prisoners to the arena began rating them like livestock, discussing which ones would provide the best entertainment value. Servants who fed the wolves started taking pride in maintaining the perfect balance of hunger and aggression. Even local priests began incorporating the executions into their sermons about divine justice and the natural order. The psychological impact on the broader population was profound and lasting. Children who witnessed these spectacles grew up understanding that human life had no inherent value beyond its entertainment potential. Adults who attended regularly began to view extreme violence as normal, even necessary for maintaining social order. The entire moral compass of the region shifted to accommodate systematic murder as acceptable public entertainment. Gilles kept detailed records of his entertainments, documents that survive today and provide horrifying insights into his methodical approach to human destruction. He tracked which types of prisoners provided the best spectacles, which wolves performed most effectively, which seasonal variations generated the most positive audience response. These weren't the random notes of a madman. They were the careful observations of someone treating murder as a science. The record keeping included detailed audience feedback that reveals how thoroughly the local population had been corrupted by these entertainments. Nobles would send written reviews praising particularly innovative executions. Merchants would request specific types of spectacles for upcoming business negotiations. Even religious officials would suggest prisoners whose deaths might serve as examples for their congregations. But the wolves were just the beginning of Gilles' experiments in human destruction. As audiences became accustomed to lupine executions, he began developing new variations that would push the boundaries of acceptable entertainment even further. The success of his wolf feeding system had proven that there were virtually no limits to what people would accept as normal, if it was presented properly and implemented gradually. The expansion of his terror system would soon involve other predators, more elaborate staging, and psychological tortures that would make the wolf feeding seem almost merciful by comparison. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It required careful preparation, methodical implementation, and the complete moral collapse of everyone who witnessed and participated in his escalating horrors. The escalation began with what Gilles called his menagerie of justice. The wolves had proven so successful at maintaining order and entertaining guests that he decided to expand his collection of executioner animals. But finding the right creatures for different types of spectacles required extensive research and experimentation that would make modern animal behaviorists recoil in horror. Gilles sent agents across Europe to acquire predators that could serve specific purposes in his growing theater of death. Bears from the northern forest for prisoners who needed to be made examples of slowly and publicly. Wild boars for quick, brutal executions that would terrify audiences with their savage efficiency. Even lions and leopards acquired through Mediterranean trade routes for the most special occasions when foreign dignitaries visited his territory. But here's what reveals the true depth of his systematic approach to terror. Each animal required different preparation methods, different types of prisoners, and different audience management strategies. Bears needed to be kept partially sedated before executions to prevent them from killing prisoners too quickly. Wild boars had to be provoked into aggressive states through controlled starvation and irritation. The exotic cats required specialized handlers who understood how to trigger their hunting instincts at precisely the right moments. The infrastructure required to maintain this expanding menagerie was staggering. Underground chambers were excavated beneath the castle to house different species in conditions that kept them aggressive but controllable. Specialized feeding schedules were developed for each type of predator. Training regimens were established to ensure animals would perform reliably during public spectacles. The castle essentially became a research facility dedicated to perfecting the art of using animals to murder humans for entertainment. The prisoner preparation process evolved along with the animal collection. Different crimes now warranted different types of animal executions, based on Gilles' twisted sense of poetic justice. Thieves were fed to quick predators like wolves or boars because their crimes were impulsive and required swift punishment. Traitors faced bears because their betrayals deserved prolonged suffering that would serve as extended warnings to others. The most serious offenses, like rebellion against noble authority, earned death by exotic cats because such crimes required the most impressive and memorable punishments. The conditioning of prisoners before their executions became increasingly sophisticated and psychologically devastating. Gilles discovered that terrorizing the condemned enhanced both their suffering and the entertainment value for audiences. Prisoners were forced to spend their final days listening to the sounds of the animals that would kill them. They were shown detailed drawings of previous executions featuring their designated predators. Some were even forced to help feed the animals that would eventually consume them. The psychological torture extended to the prisoners' families and communities. Gilles made it known that attendance at a family member's execution was mandatory. Parents had to watch their children torn apart by beasts. Spouses were required to witness their partners devoured by predators. Children who survived their parents' executions were often forced to help clean the arena afterward, ensuring the trauma would be permanently embedded in their memories. But the true genius of Gilles' expanding system was how he made each new innovation seem like a logical progression rather than an escalation of horror. The introduction of bears was presented as a more humane alternative to wolves for certain types of crimes. The exotic cats were framed as special honors reserved for the most important executions. Each addition to his menagerie was justified through carefully constructed arguments about justice, efficiency, and social order. The seasonal entertainment calendar expanded to accommodate the new varieties of animal executions. Spring renewal hunts now featured different predators chasing prisoners through increasingly elaborate obstacle courses. Summer endurance trials included multiple types of animals, released in sequence to test prisoners' survival skills against various threats. Autumn judgment spectacles became complex productions featuring different animals representing different aspects of divine retribution. Winter executions evolved into frozen hellscapes, where prisoners faced not just cold and starvation, but multiple species of hungry predators. The audience experience was enhanced through innovations that made each spectacle more immersive and memorable. Gilles introduced betting systems that allowed spectators to wager on specific outcomes. Which animal would draw first blood? How long would the prisoner survive? Would they attempt to fight back or simply accept their fate? The gambling element transformed passive observers into active participants who had financial stakes in the proceedings. Seating arrangements became more sophisticated to accommodate different types of spectacles and different social dynamics. VIP boxes were constructed for the most important guests, complete with refreshment services and heated braziers for comfort during winter executions. Special viewing platforms were built at different heights to provide optimal sight lines for different types of animal attacks. Even the acoustics were modified to ensure that every scream, every roar, every sound of tearing flesh could be heard clearly throughout the amphitheater. The documentation system expanded to track the performance characteristics of different animals and the entertainment value of various execution methods. Gilles maintained detailed logs noting which predators provided the most satisfying spectacles, which types of prisoners offered the best resistance, and which seasonal variations generated the most positive audience responses. These records reveal a mind that approached systematic murder with the methodical precision of a natural philosopher conducting experiments. The staff required to maintain this expanded operation grew into what was essentially a department of institutionalized murder. Animal trainers specialized in different species. Arena designers created increasingly elaborate settings for different types of executions. Prisoner psychologists developed methods for maximizing terror and despair in the condemned. Event coordinators managed complex logistics for spectacles that might involve multiple animals, multiple prisoners, and hundreds of spectators. The economic impact of these entertainments on the local region was profound and corrupting. Entire industries developed around supporting Gilles' spectacles. Craftsmen specialized in creating restraint devices designed for different types of animal attacks. Merchants imported exotic foods for feeding rare predators. Artists created commemorative artwork depicting famous executions. The systematic murder of human beings became a cornerstone of the regional economy. The moral transformation of the population accelerated as these entertainments became more elaborate and frequent. What had once shocked and horrified audiences gradually became familiar and expected. People began ranking different types of executions based on entertainment value. Children played games mimicking animal attacks they'd witnessed. Adults discussed upcoming executions with the same enthusiasm they might show for harvest festivals or religious celebrations. The church's role in legitimizing these horrors reveals the complete moral collapse that Gilles' system created. Local priests began incorporating animal symbolism into their sermons, explaining how different beasts represented different aspects of divine justice. Bears symbolized God's patient but inevitable punishment of sin. Wolves represented the swift retribution that awaited the wicked. Lions embodied the majesty of righteous judgment. The systematic murder of human beings was transformed into religious allegory that made participation seem not just acceptable, but spiritually beneficial. The influence of Gilles' innovations spread beyond his own territory as other nobles witnessed his spectacles and sought to implement similar systems in their own domains. Visiting lords returned home with detailed descriptions of animal execution methods. Foreign dignitaries requested copies of his arena designs. The systematic use of predators for public execution began appearing in neighboring regions as other rulers recognized both the entertainment value and the terror effectiveness of these methods. But the expansion of his menagerie was just one aspect of Gilles' evolving approach to systematic terror. He began experimenting with combinations of different torture methods that would make the animal execution seem almost merciful by comparison. The success of his predator spectacles had proven that audiences could be conditioned to accept virtually any level of horror if it was presented gradually and justified properly. The next phase of his innovations would involve human participants in ways that would blur the lines between victim and perpetrator. The moral corruption that had already infected his territory through animal spectacles had prepared the population for even more disturbing forms of entertainment. But implementing these new horrors would require careful psychological preparation and systematic desensitization that would make his previous methods seem like mere practice runs. The transformation of an entire region's moral framework was nearly complete. What had begun with simple wolf feedings had evolved into a comprehensive system of terror that touched every aspect of life in Gilles' domain. The population had been systematically conditioned to view extreme violence as normal entertainment, systematic murder as necessary justice, and human suffering as acceptable spectacle. The conditioning process that Gilles employed to transform his subjects into enthusiastic participants in mass murder reveals psychological manipulation techniques that wouldn't be fully understood by science for another 5 centuries. He didn't simply force people to watch executions, he made them want to attend. He created social pressure that made absence from these spectacles seem suspicious, even treasonous. The guest list management became a sophisticated tool of political control. Being invited to witness an execution was a mark of status and trust. Being excluded suggested you were under suspicion yourself. Gilles would deliberately omit certain nobles from invitation lists, letting rumors circulate about why they hadn't been included. Within days, these excluded individuals would send gifts and letters requesting the privilege of attending future spectacles. But here's where his manipulation reached truly diabolical levels. He began requiring active participation from his audiences. Spectators weren't allowed to simply watch passively. They had to cheer at appropriate moments. They had to express approval when animals performed well. They had to demonstrate visible satisfaction when justice was served. Guards monitored the crowd for anyone showing insufficient enthusiasm or inappropriate sympathy for the condemned. The participation requirements escalated gradually. First, audiences were expected to applaud when prisoners were brought into the arena. Then they were required to shout approval when animals were released. Eventually, they had to join in ritualized chants that celebrated the righteousness of the proceedings. Anyone who failed to participate with sufficient vigor would find themselves questioned about their loyalty to their Lord and their commitment to justice. The children's involvement was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of this systematic corruption. Gilles didn't just allow children to attend these spectacles. He made their attendance mandatory for families above a certain social status. Young minds, he understood, were more adaptable to extreme experiences. Children who grew up watching humans torn apart by beasts would never develop normal moral boundaries around violence and death. Special seating sections were designated for different age groups of children. The youngest, aged 5 to 8, were positioned where they could see the spectacle but were partially shielded from the most graphic violence. Children aged 9 to 12 had unrestricted views but were accompanied by adults who would explain the proceedings. Teenagers were expected to watch without assistance and to demonstrate appropriate reactions without coaching. The educational component of these spectacles was presented as moral instruction essential for proper development. Parents were told that witnessing executions would teach their children about justice, consequence, and the natural order of society. Children who showed distress or sympathy for the condemned were subjected to additional conditioning designed to eliminate such inappropriate responses. The most disturbing innovation was the introduction of what Gilles called apprentice participation. Teenage boys from noble families were invited to assist with arena preparation and animal handling. They would help spread fresh sand to absorb blood. They would carry tools used to manage the animals. Some were even allowed to help release predators into the arena at the designated moments. This hands-on involvement created a generation of young nobles who didn't just witness systematic murder, but actively participated in its execution. These teenagers would grow up to become the next generation of regional leaders, carrying with them the normalized acceptance of extreme violence as a tool of governance. The moral corruption became self-perpetuating across generations. The psychological impact on the animal handlers reveals another dimension of the systematic dehumanization that Gilles' spectacles created. Men who spent their days training predators to kill humans on command underwent profound personality changes. They began to view people in terms of how entertaining their deaths might be. They developed professional pride in their animals' killing efficiency. The handlers kept detailed notes on each animal's performance characteristics. Which wolves preferred to attack the throat versus the limbs? How could bears be encouraged to prolong their attacks rather than killing quickly? Which exotic cats could be trained to respond to specific signals during executions? The systematic study of how to optimize animal attacks on humans became a recognized specialty within Gilles' household. The competition between handlers added another layer of horror to the proceedings. Different trainers would vie to have their animals selected for important executions. They would boast about their predators' killing techniques and lobby for opportunities to demonstrate superior performance. The professional rivalry around training animals to murder humans became as intense as any other craft guild competition. The record-keeping expanded to include detailed performance evaluations for both animals and handlers. Successful executions that provided superior entertainment value earned bonuses and recognition. Handlers whose animals killed too quickly or failed to provide adequate spectacle faced criticism and reduced assignments. The systematic murder of human beings was managed with the same attention to quality control as any other professional service. The seasonal training regimens became increasingly sophisticated as handlers learned to modify animal behavior based on weather conditions, audience expectations, and the specific characteristics of condemned prisoners. Summer executions required animals trained to perform in heat while maintaining energy for prolonged attacks. Winter spectacles needed predators conditioned to hunt effectively in snow and cold. The breeding programs that Gilles established reveal the long-term planning behind his systematic approach to terror. He didn't just capture wild animals for immediate use. He began breeding predators specifically for arena performance, selecting for traits that would enhance their effectiveness as executioners. Wolves were bred for size and aggression. Bears were selected for intelligence and trainability. Even the exotic cats were bred to enhance specific hunting characteristics. The breeding records that survive show Gilles tracking bloodlines with the same precision used for breeding war horses or hunting dogs. Animals that produced particularly entertaining executions were used as breeding stock to pass on their desirable traits. Multiple generations of predators were born and raised with the sole purpose of killing humans for public entertainment. The genetic selection process included testing young animals on condemned prisoners to evaluate their potential for arena performance. Cubs and calves that showed insufficient aggression or killed too quickly were eliminated from the breeding program. Only animals that demonstrated the proper balance of lethality and showmanship were allowed to reproduce. The infrastructure required to support these breeding programs was extensive and reveals the industrial scale of Gilles' operation. Separate facilities were constructed for breeding animals versus performance animals. Specialized staff managed nutrition, healthcare, and training for different generations of predators. The castle grounds essentially became a research and development facility dedicated to perfecting the art of using animals to murder humans. The documentation of breeding experiments includes detailed observations about how different bloodlines affected execution quality. Certain wolf families produced animals that were more responsive to handler commands during spectacles. Specific bear lineages generated offspring with enhanced ability to prolong attacks without killing too quickly. The systematic breeding of predators for human execution was approached with scientific rigor, but the breeding programs served purposes beyond simply improving execution quality. They created a sustainable supply of executioner animals that made Gilles' terror system economically viable over the long term. Rather than constantly capturing wild predators, he could maintain his spectacles using animals bred specifically for the purpose. The systematic murder of humans became a self-sustaining industry. The training facilities evolved into sophisticated educational institutions where handlers passed on their expertise to apprentices. Young men learned not just how to manage dangerous animals, but how to optimize their killing performance for maximum entertainment value. The knowledge base around using predators to execute humans became a specialized professional discipline. The apprenticeship programs created career paths for individuals who showed aptitude for animal handling and execution management. Promising students could advance from basic animal care to specialized training roles to eventually becoming master handlers responsible for the most important spectacles. The systematic murder of humans provided economic opportunities for ambitious young men. The social status of successful animal handlers rose significantly as their skills became more valued and their expertise more specialized. Master trainers were consulted by other nobles seeking to establish their own execution spectacles. They commanded substantial salaries and enjoyed privileges normally reserved for much higher social ranks. Expertise in training animals to kill humans became a path to social advancement. The regional reputation of Gilles' execution spectacles began attracting visitors from across Europe who wanted to witness these innovations in entertainment and justice. Foreign nobles would travel for weeks to attend particularly special executions. Diplomatic missions would schedule their visits to coincide with major spectacles. The systematic murder of humans became a tourist attraction that brought prestige and economic benefit to the region. The international attention created pressure for constant innovation and improvement in execution methods. Gilles couldn't simply repeat the same types of spectacles when hosting important foreign guests. Each major event required new variations, more elaborate staging, or more exotic animals to maintain his reputation as the premier provider of execution entertainment. The competitive pressure from other nobles attempting to replicate his success forced continuous development of new techniques and methods. Visiting lords would return home with descriptions of Gilles' spectacles and attempt to create similar entertainments in their own territories. This regional competition drove innovation in systematic murder that pushed the boundaries of acceptable horror ever further. The documentation of international reactions reveals how thoroughly Gilles' methods had corrupted the moral standards of European nobility. Foreign dignitaries didn't express horror at witnessing humans torn apart by animals. They expressed admiration for the creativity and entertainment value of the spectacles. They requested detailed explanations of training methods and arena construction techniques. The diplomatic correspondence that survives includes requests from other rulers seeking to hire Gilles' animal handlers or purchase breeding stock from his predator programs. The systematic murder of humans had become an exportable expertise that enhanced Gilles' political influence and economic power. His innovations in execution entertainment became valuable diplomatic commodities. The moral transformation of European nobility through exposure to these spectacles represents one of the most profound examples of systematic dehumanization in recorded history. Individuals who arrived expressing shock and disturbance would leave discussing technical improvements and requesting return invitations. The normalization of extreme violence happened with frightening speed and thoroughness, but the international spread of these methods was just one aspect of how Gilles' innovations in systematic terror began to metastasize beyond his original territory. The success of his animal execution programs had proven that human moral boundaries were far more flexible than anyone had previously imagined. The next phase of his experiments would test just how far that flexibility could be stretched. The documentation reveals that Gilles began developing what he called participatory justice spectacles, where audiences wouldn't just watch executions but would actively determine their outcomes. The moral corruption that had already infected his territory through animal spectacles had prepared the population for even more direct involvement in systematic murder. The transformation from witnesses to participants would represent the final stage in the complete moral collapse of his domain. The participatory spectacles began with something Gilles called the Wheel of Fate. A massive wooden wheel was constructed in the center of the arena, divided into sections that corresponded to different types of animal executions. Condemned prisoners would be brought before the assembled crowd, and prominent audience members would take turns spinning the wheel to determine their method of death. The element of chance created an illusion that the spectators weren't directly choosing to murder someone, merely allowing fate to decide. But here's where Gilles' understanding of human psychology reached truly diabolical levels. He discovered that when people participated in determining someone's death, even through a random mechanism, they became emotionally invested in the outcome. Audience members who spun the wheel would lean forward with anticipation as their designated animal was released. They would cheer more enthusiastically when their spin resulted in a particularly entertaining execution. The wheel system evolved to include more complex decision points that required direct audience input. Multiple wheels were introduced for different aspects of the execution. One wheel determined the animal. Another selected the weapon, if any, that the prisoner might be given. A third chose the starting position within the arena. Each spin required a different volunteer from the audience, ensuring that multiple spectators became active participants in designing each execution. The volunteer selection process became a social ritual that revealed the complete moral collapse of Gilles' territory. Being chosen to spin a wheel was considered an honor that demonstrated trust and social standing. Nobles would compete for the privilege of participating in executions. Merchants would offer bribes for the opportunity to determine a prisoner's fate. Even religious officials would volunteer to spin wheels, claiming they were serving as instruments of divine justice. The psychological manipulation reached new depths when Gilles introduced what he called mercy options on the wheels. Some sections allowed for supposedly less brutal deaths or gave prisoners slight advantages in their final struggles. These mercy sections created the illusion that wheel spinners were showing compassion rather than simply choosing different methods of murder. Participants could tell themselves they were being merciful when they spun outcomes that gave prisoners wooden clubs or positioned them near arena walls that might provide temporary shelter. But the mercy options were carefully designed to enhance rather than reduce the entertainment value of executions. A prisoner given a small weapon would fight more desperately, providing a longer and more engaging spectacle. Starting positions near walls would encourage extended chase sequences, as prisoners tried to use obstacles for protection. What appeared to be compassionate choices actually resulted in more prolonged and theatrical deaths. The audience participation expanded beyond wheel spinning to include direct voting on execution details. Spectators would be presented with multiple options for how a particular execution should proceed and would vote by acclamation. Should the wolves be released one at a time or all together? Should the prisoner be given armor or left defenseless? Should the arena be flooded with water to create additional challenges? The crowd's collective voice would determine these specifics. The voting process created a sense of democratic participation that made individual audience members feel less responsible for the outcomes. No single person was choosing to murder the condemned. The entire community was making collective decisions about justice and entertainment. This diffusion of responsibility allowed people to participate in systematic murder while maintaining psychological distance from their individual role in the proceedings. The documentation reveals that Gilles kept detailed records of audience preferences and voting patterns. He tracked which types of executions generated the most enthusiastic participation. He noted which demographic groups preferred which types of animal attacks. He even recorded individual nobles' voting histories to better understand their personal preferences for future events. These participation records became tools for political manipulation and social control. Nobles who consistently voted for more merciful options might find themselves questioned about their commitment to justice. Merchants who showed insufficient enthusiasm for particular executions could face business difficulties. The voting patterns became evidence of loyalty or disloyalty that Gilles could use to reward supporters and punish potential threats. The social pressure to participate enthusiastically became overwhelming, as non-participation was interpreted as criticism of the proceedings. Anyone who refused to vote or spin wheels would be noticed and remembered. Their absence from participation would be discussed and analyzed. Eventually, choosing not to participate became more dangerous than actively contributing to systematic murder. The children's involvement in these participatory spectacles represents perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the complete moral corruption that Gilles achieved. Young people weren't just required to watch adults vote on execution methods. They were given their own opportunities to participate in determining prisoners' fates. Special wheels were created with age-appropriate sections that allowed children to make choices about executions without fully understanding the implications of their decisions. The children's wheels included options like choosing which color ribbons would be tied to the animals, or selecting which musical instruments would accompany the proceedings. These seemingly innocent choices gave young people the experience of participating in executions while maintaining the illusion that their decisions weren't directly related to the violence. The psychological conditioning was subtle but profound. The teenage participation was more direct and more psychologically damaging. Adolescents were allowed to vote on the same options as adults and were expected to demonstrate mature judgment in their choices. Young people who showed appropriate enthusiasm for violent options were praised and given additional opportunities to participate. Those who seemed reluctant or squeamish faced social ostracism and family disappointment. The peer pressure among teenagers to demonstrate proper attitudes toward execution entertainment created a generation of young people who competed to show the most bloodthirsty preferences. Adolescents would boast about voting for the most violent options or spinning wheels that resulted in particularly brutal deaths. The social dynamics of youth culture became twisted around celebrating participation in systematic murder. The family dynamics around these participatory spectacles reveal how completely the moral framework of the region had collapsed. Parents would coach their children on appropriate voting choices. Families would discuss upcoming executions at dinner tables, debating which options would provide the best entertainment. The systematic murder of human beings became normal family conversation that children grew up accepting as natural. The religious justification for these participatory spectacles reached new levels of theological contortion, as local priests struggled to reconcile Christian doctrine with active participation in systematic murder. They developed elaborate explanations for why voting on execution methods was actually a form of prayer. They claimed that spinning wheels was allowing God to express divine will through chants. They argued that participating in these spectacles was a religious duty that demonstrated faith in divine justice. The Church's blessing of participatory executions created a theological framework that made resistance seem not just disloyal but heretical. Anyone who questioned the morality of voting on execution methods was challenging not just secular authority but religious doctrine. The systematic murder of humans became a sacramental act that demonstrated proper spiritual devotion. The economic incentives around participation created additional pressure for enthusiastic involvement in execution entertainment. Merchants who participated enthusiastically found their businesses thriving. Craftsmen who voted with proper enthusiasm received preferential treatment in guild affairs. Even peasants discovered that showing appropriate appreciation for execution spectacles could result in reduced taxes or other economic benefits. The reward system for participation was carefully calibrated to encourage not just attendance, but active engagement with the proceedings. Simply being present wasn't sufficient to earn social and economic benefits. People needed to demonstrate genuine enthusiasm for the entertainment value of systematic murder. The rewards created positive feedback loops that made participation increasingly attractive and non-participation increasingly costly. The competitive aspects of participation escalated as audience members began trying to outdo each other in demonstrating appreciation for execution entertainment. Nobles would compete to show the most creative voting choices. Merchants would vie to demonstrate the most enthusiastic responses to violent spectacles. The social dynamics around systematic murder became a form of performance art, where participants tried to prove their superiority through their appreciation of human suffering. The seasonal variations in participatory spectacles became increasingly elaborate as Gilles refined his understanding of how to maximize audience engagement with systematic murder. Spring executions featured voting on obstacle courses that prisoners would navigate while being hunted. Summer spectacles included choices about environmental challenges like heat sources or water obstacles. Autumn events offered options for themed executions that incorporated harvest imagery. Winter programs allowed audiences to vote on cold-related torture methods that would be combined with animal attacks. The documentation reveals that audience participation levels reached extraordinary heights during these seasonal spectacles. Attendance rates approached 100% of the eligible population. Voting participation was similarly comprehensive, with detailed records showing that virtually every adult in Gilles' territory actively participated in determining execution details. The systematic murder of humans had become the primary form of community engagement and social interaction. The success of these participatory spectacles attracted attention from across Europe, as other nobles sought to replicate Gilles' innovations in audience engagement. Diplomatic visitors would attend these events specifically to study the participation methods and adapt them for use in their own territories. The systematic involvement of entire populations in murder became an exportable technique for social control and entertainment. The international influence of these methods represents one of the most disturbing aspects of how normalized systematic murder had become among European nobility. Foreign rulers didn't express horror at discovering that entire communities were actively participating in determining execution details. They expressed admiration for the creativity and effectiveness of these participation methods and sought to implement similar systems in their own domains. The correspondence between Gilles and other nobles reveals detailed discussions about participation techniques and audience management strategies. Letters survive that include specific advice about wheel construction, voting procedures, and methods for encouraging enthusiastic community involvement in execution entertainment. The systematic murder of humans had become a subject of professional consultation and technical expertise sharing. The training programs that Gilles developed for other nobles who wanted to implement similar systems created a network of execution entertainment specialists across Europe. These programs included instruction in audience psychology, participation method design, and techniques for maintaining community enthusiasm for systematic murder over extended periods. The knowledge base around involving entire populations in murder became a recognized diplomatic and political skill. But even as these participatory spectacles reached new heights of community involvement and international recognition, Gilles was already developing the next phase of his experiments in systematic terror. The success of making audiences active participants in determining execution details had proven that moral boundaries could be completely eliminated through careful psychological manipulation and social pressure. The final phase of his system would involve making audience members not just participants in planning executions, but direct participants in carrying them out. The moral corruption that had transformed his territory from horrified witnesses to enthusiastic voters was about to be tested at its ultimate limit. The next step would determine whether entire communities could be conditioned to personally commit systematic murder while maintaining the illusion that they were serving justice and providing entertainment. The transformation from voting on executions to personally participating in them would represent the complete triumph of Gilles' system of terror. If he could convince ordinary people to personally kill their neighbors for entertainment, he would have achieved the ultimate form of social control. The systematic murder of humans would become not just accepted, but personally performed by the very communities it was designed to terrorize. But this final phase would also mark the beginning of the end for Gilles' reign of terror, because there are limits to how far human moral corruption can progress before it triggers reactions that even the most sophisticated systems of terror cannot contain. The very success of his participatory murder spectacles would eventually create the conditions that would lead to his downfall and the exposure of the complete horror he had created in his domain. The wheel of fate that had seemed like such an innovative method for involving audiences in execution entertainment would ultimately become the mechanism of Gilles' own destruction. The system he had created to terrorize others would eventually turn against him in ways he never anticipated. The master of systematic murder would discover that the moral corruption he had cultivated so carefully could not be controlled indefinitely, and that the very people he had trained to participate enthusiastically in killing would eventually turn their acquired skills against their teacher.